In the dusty town of Whisper Valley, outlaws made the deadly mistake of mocking the wrong bartender. They couldn't have known that the quiet man polishing glasses had more notches on his gun than their entire gang combined, or that their cruel taunts would awaken a legend they thought long dead, the infamous Prairie Shadow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Silver Star Saloon, catching dust motes that danced in the amber light. Nate Hawkins methodically polished a glass with practiced precision, his movements as measured and quiet as the man himself. 5 years he'd been tending bar here, and in all that time Emma Hawthorne had never seen him waste a single movement or speak an unnecessary word. "Nate, have you ever thought about taking a day off?" Emma asked, counting the night's earnings. Behind the bar, her question earned her the slight upturn of his mouth that passed for a smile these days. "What would I do with a day off, Miss Emma?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, the kind of voice that made most folks lean in closer to hear. It was also the kind of voice that made them underestimate him, which suited Nate just fine. The saloon was quiet this afternoon. Just old Walt Jenkins nursing his usual whiskey in the corner, and Doc Green reading his medical journal at his regular table. The doc glanced up occasionally, his eyes meeting Nate's in that knowing way they had. Of all the people in Whisper Valley, only Doc Green knew why Nate's hands, now so careful with the delicate glassware, had once been feared throughout the Arizona Territory. The peaceful routine was interrupted by the jingle of spurs as Marshal Mallister pushed through the batwing doors, his weathered face creased with concern. "Afternoon, Emma, Nate." He nodded to them both, then made his way to the bar. "Got word from Cedar Ridge. Blackwood gang's been spotted heading this way." Nate's hands didn't pause in their work, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow so brief anyone else might have missed it. Emma didn't miss much, though. She'd been running the Silver Star long enough to read men better than most. "Red Jack Blackwood?" she asked, her voice dropping. "Thought he and his bunch stayed up north near the railroad." "Times change," Mallister sighed, accepting the coffee Nate silently placed before him. "They hit 3 banks in the last month. Latest word says they're moving south, probably looking for easier targets now that the railroad's beefed up security." Doc Green had set aside his journal, listening intently. "How many in his gang now, Bob?" 5 that we know of," the marshal replied. "Blackwood, Clay Thorne, the Reed twins, and that young hothead, Lucas Reeves. Mean bunch. They don't just rob, they make a show of it. Like to humiliate folks before they kill them." Nate's hands finally stilled on the glass he was polishing. For just a moment his fingers traced an old scar on his right palm, a habit none of them had ever mentioned, but all had noticed. "Whisper Valley's got nothing worth their trouble," Emma said firmly, as if speaking it would make it true. "They'll pass us by." "Maybe," Mallister agreed, but his eyes drifted to Nate. "Still, it might be wise to send word to Carson City, get some extra deputies out here, just in case." "Takes 3 days for help to arrive from Carson City," Nate spoke softly, resuming his work. "If they're coming, they'll be here sooner than that." The marshal studied him for a long moment. "You seem mighty sure about that." "Just arithmetic, Marshal, nothing more." But his words carried a weight that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Old Walt chose that moment to stumble to his feet, fishing in his pockets for coins. "Reckon I better head home 'fore dark. Them clouds rolling in look like rain." He nodded to Emma. "Put it on my tab, Miss Hawthorne." "Just like always, Walt," she smiled, making a note in her ledger as the old man shuffled out. Doc Green gathered his things as well. "Think I'll do the same. Nate, don't forget to pick up those medicines I ordered for your headaches. Came in on yesterday's stage." Nate nodded, though everyone in the room knew he hadn't suffered a headache in all the years they'd known him. It was just one of those little fictions they all maintained, like pretending not to notice how he always kept his right hand free when serving drinks, or how his eyes constantly scanned the room even when it was empty. As the afternoon deepened, toward evening, Grace Alley appeared for her nightly performance, her red hair catching the last rays of sunlight as she sat up near the piano. Her voice, when she began to warm up, was sweet and clear, a touch of beauty in a town that often had too little of it. "Rider coming," Emma announced from her spot by the window. "Moving fast." Nate's hands remained steady as he arranged bottles on the shelf, but his stance shifted ever so slightly. To most, he still looked like nothing more than a simple bartender preparing for the evening rush. But Marshal Mallister saw how the man's weight had settled on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. The sound of thundering hooves grew louder, then stopped abruptly outside the saloon. The batwing doors burst open, revealing a young ranch hand, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "Marshal Mallister, they're coming, the Blackwood gang. They just shot up Cedar Ridge and killed the sheriff and his deputies. They're headed this way." In the sudden silence that followed, Nate carefully set down the bottle he was holding. His movements were still measured, still precise, but now they carried an entirely different quality, like a mountain lion uncoiling before a leap. "How far?" Mallister demanded. 2 hours, maybe less. They're moving fast, and the ranch hand swallowed hard. They're killing everyone in their path. Emma's hand went to her throat. "Mother of God!" "Get word to everyone," Mallister ordered. "Tell them to bar their doors and windows. Nobody on the streets after dark." He turned to Emma. "Might want to close up early tonight." "No." Nate's quiet voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Keep the saloon open, just like any other night." They all turned to look at him, but his eyes were fixed on something distant, seeing perhaps not the bottle-lined shelves before him, but something from long ago. "Nate?" Emma's voice held a question. "Some folks need to learn," he said softly, "that the quietest rattler strikes the deepest." Evening crept into Whisper Valley like a thief, bringing with it an unseasonal chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The Silver Star Saloon maintained its usual appearance, but tension hung in the air, as thick as tobacco smoke. Grace's usual songs seemed more melancholy than ever, her voice carrying notes of warning that everyone felt but nobody mentioned. Marshal Mallister had positioned himself by the window, occasionally glancing down the darkening street. The few patrons who remained hunched over their drinks, speaking in whispers, as if afraid their voices might carry beyond the saloon walls. Even old Walt had sobered up enough to notice the change in atmosphere, his rheumy eyes darting between the door and Nate's steady presence behind the bar. "2 riders coming in from the south," Mallister announced, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. The saloon fell silent, save for the soft clink of glasses as Nate continued his work. The riders turned out to be nothing more than traveling salesmen seeking shelter for the night, but their news brought no comfort. "Passed through Cedar Ridge this morning?" the older of the 2 men said, hands shaking slightly as he lifted his whiskey. "Never seen anything like it. They didn't just rob the bank. They made examples of anyone who looked at them wrong. Sheriff Tanner." He trailed off, taking another drink. "What about Sheriff Tanner?" Emma pressed, though her face suggested she didn't really want to know. "They made him watch while they shot his deputies. Then they tied him to his horse and..." The salesman couldn't finish. Doc Green, who had returned to the saloon despite the growing danger, spoke up from his corner. "How many dead?" 7 that I counted. Would have been more, but it seems they wanted to leave enough folks alive to spread the word about what happens when you stand up to the Blackwood gang. Nate's movements had slowed almost imperceptibly as he listened. To most, he appeared absorbed in his task of inventory, but Emma noticed how his right hand kept straying to a spot under the bar where she knew a shotgun had hung, unused. For the past 5 years, The younger salesman, trying to lighten the mood, attempted a joke. "Lucky for us we've got a marshal here, right? Though I reckon even the law might want to think twice about facing Red Jack Blackwood. They say he's got 23 notches on his gun." A strange sound came from behind the bar, something between a scoff and a sigh. All eyes turned to Nate, who had paused in his work. "Something funny about that, bartender?" the young man asked, a slight edge to his voice. 23 notches, Nate said quietly, resuming his task. "Man who needs to count. That high isn't much of a gunfighter." The salesman's face reddened. "What would you know about it? You're just a—" "That's enough," Emma cut in sharply. "Nate, could you check the cellar? I think we're running low on that Kentucky bourbon." Nate nodded and moved toward the cellar door. As he passed Doc Green's table, the physician spoke in a voice only Nate could hear. "Your old wound bothering you?" "Not yet," Nate replied softly, "but it will be." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Grace struck up another song, this one about a serpent in the garden, and Marshal Mallister moved to the bar. "Emma, a word." He glanced around before continuing in a low voice. "You should know I sent a rider to Carson City, but even if they send help immediately, they won't get here in time." "I know," Emma finished. She looked toward the cellar door. "Bob, about Nate," the marshal warned. "Some secrets are best left buried." But secrets, like corpses, had a way of rising to the surface. This became apparent when 3 local cowhands burst into the saloon, their faces pale with fear. "Found Jimmy Carter's body out by Broken Spoke Creek," one of them reported breathlessly. "Shot clean through the head, execution style. His horse was still saddled, hadn't been dead for more than an hour." The news hit the room like a physical blow. Jimmy Carter was just a kid, barely 17, who helped his uncle run the general store. "They're closer than we thought," Mallister grimaced. "Emma, maybe now's the time to—" The sound of shattering glass cut through the air as the young salesman dropped his bottle. But it wasn't the noise that silenced the room, it was what followed. From somewhere in the darkness outside came the distant but unmistakable sound of gunfire, followed by screams. Nate emerged from the cellar, his face impossible to read, but there was something different about him now, something in the way he moved, as if the quiet bartender was slowly falling away like an ill-fitting coat. "Marshal," he said, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. "You might want to get these folks home while they can still make it." Mallister studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, everyone out. Head straight home, bar your doors." He turned to Emma. "You too." "This is my saloon," she started to protest, but Nate interrupted. "Please, Miss Emma, for once, don't argue." Something in his tone made her pause. She'd never heard him speak that way before, like a man who knew exactly what was coming and had seen it all before. As the patrons hurriedly filed out, Doc Green lingered. "Need any help? Best get your medical bag ready, Doc," Nate replied, beginning to move bottles from the top shelf to below the bar. "Something tells me you'll need it before morning." The sound of distant gunfire came again, closer this time, accompanied by the wild whoops of men who had left their humanity somewhere in the dust of their trail. The Blackwood gang was coming, and with them, the end of peace in Whisper Valley. As Emma finally allowed herself to be led out by Marshal Mallister, she looked back at Nate. He stood behind his bar, as he had countless times before. But now she saw what she'd been blind to all these years, the way he held himself, the deliberate precision of his movements, the watchful eyes that missed nothing. This wasn't just a man who'd seen violence, this was a man who had once been violence itself. The Blackwood gang didn't so much enter Whisper Valley as they infected it. Their arrival brought a silence that swept through the streets like a prairie fire, extinguishing all signs of life. Only the Silver Star's lights remained bright, a beacon in the growing darkness. Nate heard them before he saw them, the synchronized rhythm of 5 horses moving at a deliberate pace. Not the hurried gallop of men running from the law, but the confident stride of predators who feared nothing in their path. He kept wiping the same glass, his movements unchanged as the sound of boots and spurs grew louder on the wooden sidewalk outside. The batwing doors exploded inward with unnecessary force. Jackson Red Jack Blackwood entered first, a tall man with flame-red hair and a scarlet bandana at his throat. His duster was expensive, but spattered with dark stains that wouldn't wash out. Behind him came Clay Thorne, lean and snake-like, followed by the Reed twins. So similar in appearance, they seemed to be reflections of each other. Young Lucas Reeves brought up the rear, practically bouncing with poorly contained energy. "Well, ain't this cozy?" Blackwood's voice carried the hint of educated roots gone to seed. "Seems most establishments in this charming town decided to close early. How hospitable of you to stay open for weary travelers." Nate set down his glass with careful precision. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" "Gentlemen?" Thorne laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Hear that, Jack? He called us gentlemen." "Your best whiskey," Blackwood ordered, dropping into a chair and propping his boots on the table. "Leave the bottle." Nate reached for the top shelf, his movements measured and deliberate. He could feel their eyes on him, 5 sets of them, watching for any sign of fear or resistance. He gave them neither. "You boys aren't from around here," Nate observed quietly, placing the bottle and glasses on their table. What gave it away? Samuel Reed, or perhaps it was Daniel, grinned. "Our refined manners?" "The way you carry your guns," Nate replied, turning back toward the bar. "Low on the hip, railroad style. Nobody out here draws from that position." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem to know a lot about guns for a bartender," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Man learns things," Nate shrugged, resuming his endless glass polishing. Young Reeves, clearly itching to prove himself, drew his pistol with flourish. "Man learns things, huh? Learn anything about this?" He spun the gun around his finger, showing off. "Learn, that's a good way to shoot yourself," Nate replied without looking up. The gang laughed, all except Blackwood, who studied Nate with growing interest. "You got a name, barkeep?" "Nate. Just Nate." Blackwood nodded slowly, then without. Warning swept his arm across the table, sending bottles and glasses crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Well, just Nate, you know what I think?" Blackwood rose, his voice turning ugly. "I think you're lying to me, and I don't like being lied to." Nate finally looked up, his face impassive. "Bottle was $8. The Reed twins burst out laughing, but Blackwood silenced them with a look. He approached the bar slowly, like a wolf closing in on prey. $8? That's steep for rotgut whiskey." He reached into his coat and pulled out a coin, flicking it onto the bar. "Here's 2 bits. Buy yourself some manners." Nate looked at the coin, then back at Blackwood. "Still owes $7.75. "Clay," Blackwood said softly, "show our friend here what we do to mouthy bartenders." Thorne grinned and started forward, but at that moment the doors swung open again. Marshal Mallister stood framed in the doorway, his badge catching the lamplight. "Evening, gentlemen," he said. "Calm as Sunday morning. Might want to reconsider whatever you're thinking." "A marshal," Blackwood's smile widened. "In this little dust heap must be our lucky day." "Way I hear it," Mallister continued, stepping inside. "Cedar Ridge is missing a sheriff and some deputies. You boys wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Can't say that we do," Blackwood replied, though his hand drifted toward his gun. "But I did hear something interesting about Cedar Ridge. Heard their marshal was a coward, ran and hid while good men died." His hand drifted toward his gun. "You're not a coward, are you, Marshal?" Everything happened at once. Mallister's hand dropped to his holster, but Blackwood was faster. The shot echoed like thunder in the confined space. Mallister stumbled backward, red blooming across his chest. "Bob!" Nate's voice cracked for the first time, genuine emotion breaking through his careful facade. "Stay with me!" Mallister gasped, then crumpled to the floor. Blackwood holstered his smoking gun. "Now, where were we? Ah, yes, teaching some manners to our friend the bartender." Clay Thorne moved forward again, cracking his knuckles, but this time something had changed in Nate's demeanor. His hands had stopped their endless wiping motion, his shoulders had straightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes had taken on a look that made even Thorne hesitate. "Been a long time since I killed a man," Nate said softly, almost to himself. "Promised myself I was done with it." "Kill him," Blackwood ordered, annoyed by the delay. "Kill him slowly." Thorne reached across the bar to grab Nate's shirt, and that's when everything changed. Nate's hand moved faster than seemed humanly possible, catching Thorne's wrist and yanking him forward. There was a sharp crack as Thorne's face met the solid oak bar. He dropped like a stone, blood pooling beneath. His broken nose. "Well, well," Blackwood drawled, though his hand had dropped back to his gun. "Looks like our quiet bartender has some fight in him after all." The Reed twins spread out, flanking the bar. Young Reeves bounced on his toes, eager for action. But Nate stood perfectly still now, his eyes fixed on Mallister's motionless form. "Last chance," he said, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't possessed before. "Take your friend and ride out. Don't make me break my promise." Blackwood's laugh was genuine this time. "Or what? You'll serve us to death?" He drew his gun with lightning speed. "I think it's time we—" The sound of a shotgun being racked cut. And through his words, Nate had produced the weapon from under the bar, its double barrels now pointed squarely at Blackwood's chest. "That's what you had in mind all along, wasn't it?" Blackwood's smile turned cold. "Hiding a scattergun under the bar? Problem is, old man, you can only kill one of us before the others cut you down." "True," Nate agreed. Then, with deliberate care, he set the shotgun on the bar. "That's why I won't be using it." His right hand dropped to his side, where no gun had been visible moments before. But now, somehow, a well-worn Colt gleamed in his grip, as if it had materialized from thin air. "Been a while," Nate said softly, "since anyone called me the Prairie Shadow." The name fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition across the faces of Blackwood's gang. Even Clay Thorne, still groggy from his encounter with the bar, stopped trying to stem his bleeding nose. "The Prairie Shadow," young Reeves whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating. That's just a story. They say he died years ago." "Stories," Nate said quietly, his gun unwavering, "have a way of coming back to life." Blackwood's face had lost some of its color, but his arrogant smile remained fixed. "I heard of you. They say you killed 30 men in a single year. Say you could shoot a man's gun out of his hand at 50 paces. If I'd killed that many," Nate replied, "I wouldn't have bothered counting." The Reed twins exchanged glances, their synchronized movements betraying their nervousness. They had spread out too far, trying to flank the bar, and now found themselves exposed. "Boy," Nate addressed Reeves without taking his eyes off Blackwood, "I'm going to give you a chance your friends won't get. You're young enough to learn from mistakes. Walk out now, leave your gun, and don't stop riding till you hit Mexico." Reeves looked uncertainly at Blackwood, who spoke through clenched teeth. "You take one step toward that door, boy, and I'll kill you myself." Behind the bar, Nate shifted his weight slightly. The movement was almost imperceptible, but it caused all 5 men to flinch. "Last chance, kid. Be smart." For a moment, the young gunslinger seemed to waver. Then his face hardened. "No one calls me kid." His hand dropped to his gun. What happened next was so fast it seemed like a single motion. Reeves drew his gun, clearing leather with impressive speed, but Nate was faster, impossibly faster. His first shot took Reeves's gun hand, spinning the weapon away in a spray of blood. His second caught the young man's shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. The Reed twins drew in perfect unison, their movements mirror images of each other. Nate's gun seemed to speak twice more without him even looking in their direction. Both twins stumbled backward, clutching their gun arms, their weapons clattering to the floor. "You've lost your edge, Shadow," Blackwood sneered, though sweat had broken out on his forehead. "Time was, you'd have killed them all." "Still might," Nate replied calmly. "Depends on what happens next." Claythorne had managed to regain his feet, blood still streaming from his nose. His hand strayed toward his gun. "I wouldn't," Nate warned. "You're slower than the others, and I've got one bullet left." "One bullet?" Blackwood laughed, but there was a hysterical edge to it. "Against the two of us? Those aren't good odds, old man." "Better than you think." Nate's eyes flickered to Mallister's still form. "Bob was more than just a marshal to me. He was there that day in Deadwood when I hung up my guns, made me promise to stop killing, made me swear I'd find another way." His voice grew softer. "But he's dead now, and that promise died with him." A movement caught Nate's eye. Emma Hawthorne stood in the doorway, a rifle in her hands. She had returned despite his warnings, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. She understood, stepping back into the shadows. "Deadwood," Blackwood said slowly, recognition dawning. "That's where you killed Mad Dog Matthews and his whole gang. 8 men, they say." "9, Nate corrected. "People always forget about the lookout. And now you?" 10. "Bar," Thorne spat blood onto the floor. "How the mighty have fallen. Man needs peace," Nate replied. "I found mine here, until you brought war to my door." Outside, thunder rumbled, a storm approaching, or perhaps just the echo of the earlier gunfire. The wounded men groaned softly, but no one moved to help them. "Way I see it," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone, "we at a stalemate. You're good, maybe the best there ever was, but you can't watch all of us at once. The minute you turn to shoot one, the other will put you down." "True," Nate agreed. "If I was still the man who needed to outdraw his enemies." He nodded toward the shotgun still lying on the bar. "But I own a saloon now, and a saloon owner, well, he likes to keep a few surprises under the bar." Blackwood's eyes widened as he spotted the thin wire running from behind the bar to the shotgun's trigger. Nate's boot was resting on something, a pedal, probably salvaged from an old piano. "First man to draw," Nate explained quietly, "gets both barrels. Won't even need to aim." After that, he shrugged. "Like you said, one bullet left." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the wounded had stopped their moaning, sensing the tension building toward its breaking point. "You're bluffing," Thorne growled, but his hand had moved away from his gun. "Maybe," Nate agreed. "Question is, who wants to find out first?" A drop of sweat rolled down Blackwood's temple. His fingers twitched near his gun, but he didn't draw. The legend of the prairie. Shadow had grown over the years, but the reality standing before them was somehow more terrifying than the stories. "We could still work this out," Blackwood said, forcing a smile. "Way I hear it, you used to ride with some pretty rough men yourself. Maybe we could—" "You killed my friend," Nate interrupted, his voice colder than anyone in the room had ever heard it. "There's only one way this works out now." Behind them, Doc Green had silently entered through the back door and was checking Mallister's pulse. He caught Nate's eye and gave a slight nod. The marshal was alive, barely. The knowledge seemed to change something in Nate's demeanor. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of finality. "I've spent 5 years serving drinks to good, men and bad, listening to their stories, watching their habits, learning how each man draws, how each man thinks." Neither Blackwood nor Thorne answered, but their eyes were fixed on his gun hand. "I learned that the quiet ones—" Nate's finger tightened imperceptibly on the trigger, are always the most dangerous. Him in Cedar Ridge, the ones I should have known were coming. His eyes met hers. "Get them out, please." The hoofbeats stopped outside. Boot steps approached the saloon doors, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the metallic click of weapons. Being readied. "Well, Shadow," Blackwood's smile widened, "still think you can read every man's intentions?" "No," Nate replied, moving to stand between the approaching footsteps and his wounded friend. "But I can read yours, and I know what's coming through that door isn't near as dangerous as what's already inside." Lightning flashed once more, and in its brilliant glare, the prairie shadow's silhouette seemed to grow, spreading across the floor like a promise or a warning. The saloon doors creaked open slowly, deliberately. Through the gap came the gleam of gun barrels, maybe 10 of them. The storm's fury painted everything in shades of shadow and lightning, turning the armed men into looming silhouettes. "Quite a reunion," the lead figure drawled, stepping into the light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from granite and eyes like chips of ice. The famous prairie shadow, tending bar in a dusty nowhere town. Almost didn't believe it when the boys rode out to tell us. "Wade Hawkins," Nate said quietly. "Still riding with trash, I see." "Still breathing," Wade corrected, his eyes taking in the scene, his captured companions, the wounded men, the growing pool of blood around Marshal Mallister. Which is more than I can say for some folks. More men filed in behind him, spreading out with practiced precision. Emma, still trying to help Doc Green move Mallister, counted 8 guns, all pointed at Nate. "Emma," Nate's voice was soft but carried an edge of steel. "Get Bob out, now." "Nobody's going anywhere," Wade commanded. His men shifted to block both exits. "Not until we settle some old business." Blackwood, still handcuffed, laughed from his position on the floor. "Told you there'd be complications, Shadow. Wade's been running what's left of the Matthews gang since you killed the old mad dog." "Deadwood," Wade nodded. "Been a long time since anyone spoke that name, but some debts don't fade with time." Nate's gun hadn't moved, still trained on Blackwood, but his eyes scanned the room, reading angles, distances, shadows. "Your brother made his choice in Deadwood," he said to Wade. "Same as Mad Dog did." "My brother was 17. Wade's voice cracked like a whip. "Your brother was a killer," Nate corrected. "Same as you. Same as Mad Dog. He chose his path." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the hatred in Wade's eyes. "And you chose to gun him down, shot him in the back while he was running." "No." Nate's denial was flat, absolute. "I shot him in the front while he was drawing on a woman and her child. I saw his eyes when he died. He knew what he was doing, just like you know what you're doing now." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Doc Green had managed to get Mallister into a sitting position against the wall. But the marshals' breathing was labored. 8 guns, Wade said softly. 8 experienced killers against one washed-up legend playing bartender. How do you like those odds, Shadow? "Better than you'd think." Nate's voice remained steady. "Because I've been watching your men since they walked in. The one by the window. He's favoring his right leg. Old injury, probably. Slows his draw. The 2 by the bar are standing too close together. They'll get in each other's way. The one behind you is scared. His gun hand's shaking so bad he's likely to shoot one of his own." Wade's eyes narrowed. "You always talk too much." "Part of being a bartender," Nate replied. "You learn to read people, learn their habits, their fears, like how your left eye twitches when you're about to draw, just like it did in Deadwood, just before your brother died." The words hit Wade like physical blows. His face contorted with rage. "Kill him!" he roared. "Kill him now!" What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, yet was over in seconds. Nate moved like liquid shadow, his gun barking 3 times before anyone could react. The first shot took out the lamp above Wade's head, plunging half the room into darkness. The second caught the floorboard at the feet of the two men by the bar, sending them stumbling into each other. The third hit the window behind the injured gunman, making him duck instinctively. In the confusion, Nate rolled behind an overturned table as guns blazed, bullets splintering wood and shattering bottles, filling the air with the smell of gunpowder. And spilled whiskey. "Get Bob out!" Nate shouted to Emma over the chaos. "Doc, go with her!" Emma and Green half-carried, half-dragged Mallister toward the back door as Wade's men tried to adjust to the darkness. "Spread out," Wade commanded. "He's just one man." One man who knows this room better than he knows himself. Nate's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. One man who spent 5 years memorizing every creak in these floorboards, every shadow cast by these lamps, every angle bullets can travel. A shot rang out, and one of Wade's men screamed, his gun hand suddenly useless. "One man," Nate continued, "who's had 5 years to prepare for exactly this kind of night." Another shot. Another cry of pain. Wade's men were shooting at shadows now, at movements glimpsed in lightning flashes, at the ghost of a legend who seemed to be everywhere at once. "You're just proving what I always said," Wade shouted into the darkness. "You're a killer, Shadow, a cold-blooded murderer hiding behind fancy words and a bartender's apron." "No!" Nate's voice was closer now. "I'm what Bob taught me to be, a man who chooses his battles, and right now I'm choosing to give your men a chance to walk away." One of Wade's gunmen suddenly bolted for the door, then another. In the storm's flickering light, their fear was plain to see. "Cowards!" Wade roared. "Stand and fight!" "They're not cowards," Nate said quietly. "They're smart. They figured out what you haven't, that there's a difference between being willing to kill and being willing to die." Only 3 of Wade's men remained now, plus Wade himself. Blackwood watched it all with a mixture of fury and fascination, his earlier bravado replaced by something like awe. "Come on, Shadow," Wade challenged, spinning in place, trying to locate his target. "Face me like a man, or are you just going to hide in the dark like the coward who shot my brother?" "I didn't hide then." Nate's voice came from directly behind him. "And I'm not hiding now." Wade whirled, his gun coming up, but he was far too late. The prairie shadow stood less than 3 feet away, his weapon already leveled. "Your brother died trying to murder innocents," Nate said softly. "Is that really the legacy you want to die for?" Lightning flashed one final time, illuminating them both in stark relief. Wade with hatred twisting his features, Nate with the calm certainty of a man who had made peace with violence long ago, and in the frozen moment, Wade's left eye twitched. The shot came not from Wade, but from behind. One of his remaining men had circled around in the chaos. Nate felt the bullet tear through his left shoulder, spinning him sideways. His own shot at Wade went wide, shattering a mirror behind the bar. "Not so legendary now, are you?" Wade laughed, regaining his confidence as Nate stumbled against a table, the great prairie shadow, bleeding like any other man. Nate's gun hand stayed steady, but blood darkened his shirt at an alarming rate. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was bad enough to matter, to slow him down, to make him human. "Emma!" he shouted, hearing movement near the back door. "I told you to get out, not without you," she called back, and he heard the distinctive sound of her rifle being cocked. "Don't!" he warned, but it was too late. Emma's shot caught one of Wade's remaining men in the leg, dropping him, but the muzzle flash gave away her position. Wade's other man was already turning, his gun rising. Nate didn't hesitate. He threw himself across the room, his injured shoulder, screaming in protest, and tackled Emma as the outlaw's bullet whistled through the space where she had been. They crashed behind the bar together as bottles exploded overhead. "Touching," Wade's voice dripped with mockery. "The shadow does have a heart after all. Makes me wonder." A pause, then, "Bring the marshal back in here." Nate's blood ran cold. As he heard the sounds of struggle, one of Wade's men must have circled around outside. He had Doc Green at gunpoint, forcing him and Mallister back through the door. "Let them go," Nate called out, his voice steady despite the pain. "This is between us." "No," Wade replied. "This is about family. About watching the ones you love die, just like I had to watch my brother die, the great prairie shadow, brought low by the same weakness that retired him in the first place. You care too much." Emma tried to rise, but Nate held her down as more bullets splintered the bar above them. "Stay still," he whispered. "Please." "You can't save them all, Shadow," Wade shouted. "Just like you couldn't save that woman in Deadwood. What was her name? Sarah?" The name hit Nate like a physical blow. 5 years of peace, of trying to forget, crashed down around him. He saw Sarah's face, heard her last words, felt her blood on his hands all over again. "You don't know what he wanted." Wade's finger tightened on the trigger. "You killed him." "He forced my hand," Nate corrected gently, "just like you're trying to force it now. But ask yourself, is this really about your brother? Or is it about, you trying to live up to a legacy of violence that never brought anyone peace?" Wade's gun barrel dipped slightly, uncertainty warring with rage on his face. Behind him, his last 2 men exchanged glances and began moving slowly toward the exit. "You can still walk away," Nate continued, close enough now that Wade's gun nearly touched his chest. "Can still choose a different path. That's what Bob taught me, that it's never too late to change." "Boss," one of the remaining outlaws called from the doorway, "we're leaving. This ain't worth dying for." "Cowards!" Wade's shout was ragged. "All of you! The great prairie shadow is right in front of us, unarmed, and you're running." "No." Nate's voice was barely a whisper now. "They're not running. They're living. Something your brother never got the chance to learn." Wade's gun pressed against Nate's chest, right over his heart. "I could kill you right now, end the legend once and for all." "Could," Nate agreed. "But you won't, because you finally figured out what I learned 5 years ago, that pulling a trigger is easy. Living with it afterward, that's the hard part." For a long moment, the only sound was the fading storm and Wade's ragged breathing. Then slowly, incredibly, his gun barrel began to lower. "What are you doing?" Blackwood demanded from the floor. "Kill him! Kill all of them!" But Wade wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on Nate's, seeing perhaps for the first time what his brother had seen in those final moments. Not a legend, not a killer, but a man who carried the weight of every life he'd taken. "My brother," Wade said heavily. "He really..." "Wood did draw first?" "Yes," Nate replied softly, "and his last words were about you, about hoping you'd choose a better path." The gun slipped from Wade's fingers, hitting the floor with a finality that seemed to echo through the years. Behind him, his last men melted away into the night, leaving only the sound of distant hoofbeats. "It's over," Nate said quietly, not just to Wade, but to everyone in the room. "The killing stops here." Emma emerged from behind the bar, her rifle, trained on Wade, but her eyes on Nate. Doc Green resumed tending to Mallister, whose breathing had steadied. And outside, the storm finally broke, moonlight streaming through the windows to paint silver paths across the bullet-scarred floor. Wade sank to his knees, years of hatred and vengeance draining from him like blood from a wound. What happens now?" Nate's reply was interrupted by a weak voice from the corner. "Now," Marshal Mallister said, struggling to sit up, "we all learn to live with our choices, just like I taught him to do all those years ago. The prairie." Shadow looked at his old friend, then at the woman who had given him a chance at a new life, then finally at the man who had come to kill him but found redemption instead. "No," he corrected gently. "Now we learn to live with our choices, together." Dawn broke over Whisper Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. The Silver Star Saloon bore the scars of the night's violence. Bullet holes in the walls, broken glass glinting on the floor, bloodstains that would never quite wash away. But it still stood, much like the man who had defended it. Nate worked methodically behind the bar, his left arm in a sling, cleaning glasses just as he had done every morning for the past 5 years. The routine was the same, but something had changed, not just in him, but in the very air of the place. "You don't have to do that now," Emma said softly, watching him from the doorway. "Doc Green said you need rest." "Rest can wait," Nate replied, not looking up. "Some things need to be put right first." Through the window, they could see Marshal Mallister being tended to in Doc Green's office across the street. The lawman would live, though he'd carry another scar to add to his collection. In the jail next door, Wade and his surviving men sat quietly in their cells, their fighting spirits broken not by violence, but by understanding. "Word's already spreading," Emma continued, moving to help him despite his protests. "About what? Happened here. About who you really are." "Who I was," Nate corrected gently. "The Prairie Shadow died last night along with a lot of old ghosts." "Did he?" Emma's voice carried a hint of doubt. "Those men who ran, they'll talk. More will come, looking to make a name for themselves." Nate finally stopped his work, looking at her directly. "Let them come. They'll find what those before them found. Just a bartender who listens more than he shoots." The morning light caught the silver in his hair, the new lines around his eyes. He looked both older and younger somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted even as a new one settled in its place. "You're really going to stay?" Emma asked, hope warring with concern in her voice. "Even after all this?" "5 years ago," Nate said slowly, "Bob Mallister found me in Deadwood, drowning in guilt and whiskey after Sarah's death. He could have drawn on me, tried to bring in what was left of the Prairie Shadow. Instead, he sat down and ordered a drink, talked to me about peace, about choices, about the difference between living and just surviving." He touched the scar on his shoulder, still fresh and painful. "Last night, I finally understood what he was trying to teach me. It's not about hanging up your guns or pretending the past never happened. It's about choosing who you want to be every single day." The door creaked open, and old Walt shuffled in, right on time for his morning drink. He paused, taking in the destruction, then smiled toothlessly. "Heard there was some excitement last night," he said, settling onto his usual stool. "Sorry I missed it." Nate's lips twitched in what might have been a smile as he poured the old man his usual. Some things, at least, hadn't changed. Towns already. "Talking about rebuilding," Emma said, watching Walt take his first sip. "Marshal Mallister says he'll recommend a commendation for how you handled things, without killing anyone, I mean. Bob always did believe in redemption." Nate nodded. "Even for men like Wade. Maybe especially for men like Wade." Through the window, they could see people beginning to emerge from their homes, life returning to Whisper Valley. Children played in the street. Women hung laundry. Men nodded respectfully as they passed the saloon. But there was something different in how they looked at the Silver Star now. Not fear exactly, but awareness. Understanding. "You know," Emma said thoughtfully, "I always wondered why you chose this place. Why here, of all the towns you could have disappeared to?" Nate was quiet for a long moment, his hands moving automatically through their familiar routine. "Because it was quiet," he said finally. "Because it needed someone to tend the bar and listen to stories. Because—" He paused, looking around at the bullet-scarred walls, the broken bottles, the first rays of sun, painting everything in new light. Because some places, like some people, deserve a second chance. The door opened again, and Doc Green entered, looking exhausted but satisfied. "Marshall's going to make it," he announced. "Says he wants to talk to you, Nate, about the future." "Future's right here," Nate replied, gesturing to the saloon around. "And them." "Always was." As if to emphasize his point, he reached up and removed the shotgun from its hiding place behind the bar. Everyone watched as he unloaded it, then placed it carefully in a box with his gun belt. "Won't you need those?" Emma asked softly. "If others come looking for the shadow?" "No," Nate shook his head. "Because they won't find him." They'll find what Wade and his men found, something a lot more dangerous than a fast gun. And what's that? Doc Green asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. A man at peace with his past, Nate replied, returning to his endless task of polishing glasses. A man who learned that the hardest battles are won with words instead of bullets. A man who finally understood what Bob was trying to teach him all along. Which is, Emma pressed. Nate looked up, and in his eyes they saw not the deadly gunfighter of legend, not the quiet bartender of the past 5 years, but something new, something that combined the strength of one with the wisdom of the other. That true. And courage isn't about being faster than the other man's bullet, he said softly. It's about being strong enough to offer him a drink instead. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night. Whisper Valley stirred to life around them, forever changed but somehow stronger for it. And in the Silver Star Saloon, a bartender who had once been a legend continued his work, one glass at a time, at peace with who he had been and who he had chosen to become. The prairie shadow was gone, but something better had taken his place, a man who had learned that the greatest victories are won not with a gun, but with understanding. A man who had finally found his true calling, not in dealing death, but in pouring hope, one drink at a time, in a dusty saloon where legends could rest and ordinary men could find redemption. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right? On your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. 2 years had passed since Blackwood's gang rode away from Whisper Valley. The town had flourished, growing from a dusty outpost to a respectable settlement with a new schoolhouse, a proper doctor's office, and even a small bank. The Silver Star remained its beating heart, though Nate had transformed it from a simple saloon into something closer to a tavern, a place where families could gather, where meals were served alongside drinks, where music played more often than guns fired. But peace, like shadows, was never meant to last forever. Nate felt it first, a shift in the air, a tension carried on the afternoon breeze. Standing on the tavern's front porch, he watched a lone rider approach from the east, silhouetted against the setting sun. Something about the man's posture, the deliberate pace of his horse, sent a familiar chill down Nate's spine. "Wade," he called without turning, knowing the deputy would be making his evening rounds nearby. "We got company." Wade Hawkins materialized from between buildings, his time as Whisper Valley's deputy having taught him some of Nate's talent for silent movement. The badge on his chest caught the fading sunlight as he squinted toward the approaching figure. "Know him?" Wade asked, his hand resting lightly on his holster. "Don't recognize the horse or the rider," Nate replied. "But something's not right." The stranger drew closer, resolving into a gaunt man with a weathered face and trail-stained clothes. His horse moved with the awkward gait of an animal pushed too hard for too long. As he reached the edge of town, he swayed in the saddle, then pitched forward, hitting the ground in a cloud of dust. Nate and Wade were moving before the dust settled, rushing to the fallen stranger. Doc Green, emerging from his nearby office, spotted the commotion and hurried to join them, medical bag in hand. "Bullet wound," the doctor announced after a quick examination. "Left shoulder, at least 2 days old. Infected." He looked up at Nate. "Help me get him to my office." Between them, they carried the unconscious man to Doc's treatment room. Emma, spotting them from the Silver Star, followed with a basin of clean water and fresh linens. The stranger burned with fever, his skin hot to the touch despite the cool evening air. While Doc worked to clean and treat the wound, Nate examined the man's belongings. His saddlebags yielded little, some jerky, a canteen, ammunition for a gun he wasn't carrying. But inside his coat pocket, Nate found a crumpled, blood-stained telegraph slip. He smoothed it carefully, reading the faded message by the lamplight. "What Is it? Emma asked, noting the sudden stillness that had come over her husband. Nate handed her the paper. Trouble. The telegram was brief. Be dead, stop. See escaped prison. Stop heading your way with Thorn Gang. Stop, get out now, stop. It was signed simply friend. Who's B? Emma asked, though the worry in her eyes suggested she already knew. Blackwood, Wade answered, reading over her shoulder. Red Jack Blackwood. And C? Doc Green inquired without looking up from his work. On the wounded man, Nate's expression darkened. Clay Thorne, Blackwood's right hand. He studied the unconscious messenger. Reckon our visitor was trying to warn us. But who sent him? Emma pressed. Who's this friend? Before anyone could speculate further, the stranger's eyes fluttered open, pale blue, sharp, despite the fever. Hawkins, he rasped, his gaze finding Nate with unnerving precision. Prairie Shadow. That name doesn't mean anything anymore, Nate replied quietly. Who are you? The man swallowed with difficulty, his parched throat working. Luke Reeves. You shot me. 2 years back. In your saloon. A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. My gun hand, my shoulder. Recognition dawned on Nate. Young Lucas Reeves, the hot-headed kid who'd ridden with Blackwood, the one Nate had offered a chance to walk away. Why are you here? Wade demanded, suspicion evident in his tone. Warning, Reeves managed, his strength clearly fading. Thorne killed Blackwood, took over the gang, said it was time to finish what Jack started. He gripped Nate's arm with surprising strength. They're coming, not just for you, for everyone, the whole town. How many? Nate asked. 30, maybe more. Reeves coughed, a wet, ominous sound. Recruited every hard case from here to the Dakotas. Promised them the glory of killing the Prairie Shadow. When? 3 days, maybe less. Reeves's grip loosened as consciousness began to slip away again. Thorne's not like Blackwood. No pride, no code, just hate. His eyes focused one last time on Nate. You gave me a chance once. I didn't take it. I'm taking it now. Then he was gone, slipping back into fevered unconsciousness. Doc Green shook his head grimly. Infection's deep. If he makes it through a night, it'll be a miracle. Nate straightened, decision crystallizing in his eyes. Wade, get Marshal Mallister. Emma, find Mayor Billings. We need to call the town council now. An hour later, Whisper Valley's leadership had gathered in the back room of the Silver Star. The mood was grim as Nate relayed Reeves's warning. 30 men, Mayor Billings spluttered, his jowls quivering with indignation. That's not a gang, that's an army. We faced down Blackwood's bunch before, Samuel Porter, the blacksmith, pointed out. We can do it again. This is different, Wade cautioned. I knew Clay Thorne, rode with him. He's not coming for a showdown or to prove a point. He's coming for blood. Then we evacuate, Billings declared. Send the women and children to Carson. City until this blows over. No time, Mallister shook his head. If Thorne's as close as Reeves says, they'd be caught on the open road. Besides, once they've finished with us, what's to stop them from going after our families next? What about the army? Emma suggested. The fort at Reynolds Crossing. 3 days hard ride, Wade cut in. Even if they sent help immediately, it wouldn't get here in time. A heavy silence fell over the room as the reality of their situation sank in. They were on their own. So what do we do? Doc Green finally asked, looking to Nate. Despite not holding any official position in the town, everyone instinctively turned to the former gunslinger for guidance. Nate's eyes met Emma's across the room. In that silent exchange, something profound passed between them. Understanding, resolve, and beneath it all, a love that had only deepened with time. Don't. Nate's voice was barely a whisper. That's right, Wade pressed his advantage. The boys told me all about her. How you tried to leave this life behind for her. How Mad Dog's gang found you anyway. How you weren't fast enough to save her. Don't. And now history repeats itself. Wade's boots creaked on the floorboards as he moved closer. The marshal who tried to save your soul. The woman who gave you a chance at a new life. The doctor who kept your secrets. Which one should die first? Emma's hand found Nate's in the darkness behind the bar. Whatever happens, she whispered, you gave us 5 years of peace. That's worth something. But Nate barely heard her. His mind was racing backward through time, to that night in Deadwood, when it had all gone wrong, when he'd been too confident, too sure of himself, too convinced that his reputation would keep Sarah safe. I can't, he started, his voice cracking. Can't what? Wade taunted. Can't save them? Can't bear to watch them die? Or can't admit that everything Bob taught you about peace was a lie? The storm outside had begun to fade, the thunder growing more distant. In the relative quiet, Nate could hear Mallister's labored breathing, Doc Green's attempts to keep him steady, Emma's heart pounding next to him. You know what your problem is, Shadow? Wade continued. You never understood what this life really means. It's not about being the fastest or the deadliest. It's about being willing to do whatever it takes, to sacrifice anyone and anything to win. Nate closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his gun, the burn of his wound, the tremor in his hands that came not from fear, but from something deeper. The knowledge that whatever he did next would define him forever. You're right, he said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the smoky air. I do care too much. Always have. He squeezed Emma's hand once, then let go. That's what Bob saw in me all those years ago. Not just a fast gun, but a man who could feel the weight of every trigger pull, every life taken. Philosophy won't save them, Wade sneered. No, Nate agreed, but it might save you. He raised his voice. All of you, listen carefully. In about 10 seconds, I'm going to stand up. I'm going to drop my gun, and then you're going to have a choice. The only choice, Wade laughed, is which one dies first. Wrong. Nate's voice had changed, becoming something ancient and terrible. The choice is whether you want to be the men who killed an injured marshal, a doctor trying to save lives, and an innocent woman, or the men who walked away and lived to tell about it. You're in no position to make threats, Wade said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Not a threat, Nate replied, a prophecy. Because if you harm any of them, if you spill one more drop of innocent blood in this saloon, then the Prairie Shadow stops trying to save your lives and goes back to what he does best. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wounded had stopped their moaning, sensing something momentous about to unfold. You're bluffing, Wade said finally, but his voice shook slightly. Am I? Nate asked softly. You've heard the stories. You know what I was, what I can be again. So ask yourself, do you really want to force that choice? Do you want to be the one who brings death back to life? Emma felt him shifting beside her, preparing to rise. Nate, she whispered, don't. But he was already standing, his gun held loosely at his side. Blood dripped steadily from his wounded shoulder, but his eyes were what held everyone transfixed. They were no longer the eyes of a bartender or even of a legendary gunfighter. They were the eyes of a man looking into an abyss and choosing to step forward anyway. Time seemed to crystallize in the smoke-filled saloon. Nate stood exposed, his gun pointed at the floor, blood darkening his left sleeve. Wade and his remaining men held their positions, weapons trained on their various hostages. Even the storm outside had hushed, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "Drop the gun," Wade ordered, but his voice trembled slightly. Nate's weapon hit the floor with a sound like distant thunder. The clatter echoed through the room, emphasized by the absolute silence that followed. "There," Nate said quietly. "Now you have what you wanted." The Prairie Shadow, unarmed and bleeding, His eyes found Wade's across the room. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "Kill him," Blackwood called from his position on the floor, still handcuffed. "Kill him now, before he tries something." But Wade hesitated, and in that hesitation Nate saw something he recognized. The same doubt he'd felt in Deadwood the moment before everything changed. "Your brother had that same look," Nate said softly. "Right before he made his choice. Right before he decided that killing was easier than living with doubt." "Shut up!" Wade's gun wavered slightly. "You don't get to talk about him." "I remember every man I've killed," Nate continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Every face, every moment. Your brother's eyes were green like your mother's. He told me that right before he drew. Said it was the only good thing he got from her." Wade's face went pale. How did you—" "Because I listened," Nate replied simply. "That's what Bob taught me. That every man, even the ones you have, to kill, deserves to be heard, to be remembered." "Boss," one of Wade's remaining men called nervously, "something ain't right here." 5 years, Nate went on, taking a small step forward. 5 years I've poured drinks and listened to stories, learned that every man who walks through those doors is carrying something. Pain, fear, regret. Another step. "Even you, Wade. Especially you. Stay back." Wade's gun tracked Nate's movement, but his hand was shaking now. "You know what I learned most of all?" Nate's voice dropped lower, becoming almost gentle. "I learned that the man who needs everyone to fear him is usually the most frightened of all." At that moment, several things happened at once. Doc Green, seeing Wade's attention fixed on Nate, shifted his weight to shield the wounded marshal. Emma's hand found the butt of her fallen rifle beneath the bar, and the last of Wade's loyal men began backing toward the door. "Now!" Wade shouted, but his men didn't move. They had seen something in Nate's eyes that scared them more than their leader's wrath. "They're not going to shoot," Nate said with quiet certainty, "because they finally understand what Bob taught me years ago, that there's a difference between being a killer and being a murderer." "They'll shoot if I tell them to shoot." Wade's voice rose to a desperate pitch. "No," Nate shook his head slowly. "They won't, because they can feel it. What's coming? What happens if they cross that line?" He took another step forward. "You feel it too, don't you, Wade? That voice in your head telling you this isn't what your brother would have wanted." 3 weeks had passed since the night Whisper Valley learned the truth about Nate Hawkins. The Silver Star Saloon had been restored, bullet holes patched, broken glass replaced, bloodstains scrubbed away. But some marks couldn't be erased so easily, particularly those left on the souls of men. Marshal Mallister sat at his usual spot at the bar, nursing a coffee instead of whiskey. His recovery had been slow but steady, the bullet wound in his chest a constant reminder of how close he'd come to meeting his maker. "Think I'll be able to ride out to the Carson Ranch by week's end," he said, watching Nate polish a glass with the same methodical precision as always. "Rumors of cattle rustlers moving through." Nate nodded, saying nothing. Some habits were harder to break than others. "Could use a deputy, you know," Mallister continued casually. "Someone who knows how to read a man's intentions before they ever clear leather." The bartender's hands paused briefly. "Already got a job, Bob." "So I see," Mallister smiled, glancing around the near-empty saloon. The afternoon sun slanted through freshly cleaned windows, catching dust motes that danced lazily in the golden light. "Business booming, is it?" Before Nate could answer, the bat-wing doors swung open. The sudden silence that followed told its own story. A stranger stood framed in the doorway. Tall, lean, dressed in black from hat to boots, with matching Colts riding low on each hip. His eyes, cold as January frost, surveyed the room before settling on Nate. "They said I'd find him here," the man drawled, his voice carrying a hint of Texas in its cadence. "The infamous Prairie Shadow playing bartender." Emma emerged from the back room, her face tightening at the newcomer's words. This was the third such visitor in as many weeks. Word had spread faster than wildfire about the events at the Silver Star, each telling growing taller than the last. In some versions, Nate had killed 20 men that night. In others, he'd faced down the entire Blackwood gang with an empty gun. "Can I help you with something?" Nate asked quietly, continuing his work as if the man had merely inquired about the weather. The stranger sauntered to the bar, spurs jingling with each step. "Name's Hollis Drake. Maybe you've heard of me." "Can't say that I have," Nate replied. Drake's face darkened. "Killed 7 men in Silver Creek last month, 2 more in Junction City. Papers call me the Texas Tornado." "Congratulations." Nate set down a clean glass and picked up another. "What can I get you?" "I didn't ride 300 miles for a drink," Drake snapped, his hand hovering near his right-hand Colt. "I came to see if the stories were true, if the great prairie shadow was really hiding out in this dust hole, washing glasses instead of making his mark on the world." Mallister shifted on his stool, but a subtle shake of Nate's head kept the marshal seated. "Well, now you've seen," Nate said evenly. "Anything else I can help you with?" Drake leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "They say you're the fastest gun alive. I aim to find out." "Not interested," Nate replied, his eyes never leaving the glass in his hands. "Wasn't asking." Drake's hand moved to his holster, but before his fingers could close around the grip, a voice rang out from the doorway. "I wouldn't." All eyes turned to see Wade Hawkins standing just inside the entrance. The former outlaw looked different now, clean-shaven, wearing simple clothes rather than the flashy attire he'd favored 3 weeks ago. At his hip rode a single gun, not for show but for purpose. "This isn't your concern," Drake snarled, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "You're about to draw on an unarmed man in front of witnesses, including a U.S. Marshal," Wade replied calmly, nodding toward Mallister. "I'd say that makes it everyone's concern." Drake's eyes darted between Wade and Nate, uncertainty creeping into his expression. "Unarmed? This man's a legend." "This man," Wade interrupted, stepping further into the saloon, "is a bartender. The prairie shadow's gone. Died the same night I buried my own foolish notions about glory and revenge," Drake scoffed. "And who the hell are you to lecture me?" "Nobody special," Wade shrugged. "Just a man who learned the hard way that some legends are best left alone." He moved to the bar, positioning himself between Drake and Nate. "Now, either order a drink or move on. Your choice." For a long, tense moment, it seemed Drake might draw anyway. His fingers twitched, his breathing quickened, all the tells Nate had learned to read over years of watching men decide between prudence and ruin. "This ain't over," Drake finally muttered, backing toward the door. "Not by a long shot." "Yes," Nate spoke up for the first time since Wade's arrival. "It is." Something in his tone, a quiet certainty that brooked no argument, made Drake hesitate at the threshold. Then, with a final venomous glare, he was gone, the clatter of his spurs fading into the afternoon heat. "Coffee?" Nate asked Wade already, reaching for a cup. "You pour in? I'm drinking," Wade replied, settling onto a stool. He nodded at Mallister. "Marshal Hawkins." The lawman's tone was neutral, neither friendly nor hostile. "Judge Harrison signed off on your release papers this morning, said your testimony against what's left of the Blackwood gang was worth the reduced sentence." "Appreciate that." At the heart of this transformation stood the Silver Star Saloon, no longer just a place to drink away troubles, but a gathering spot for a town finding its identity. And behind its bar, as always, worked Nate Hawkins, once the Prairie Shadow, now simply the quiet man who had taught Whisper Valley the true meaning of strength. Wade Hawkins settled into his role as deputy with surprising ease, his insight into the criminal mind proving invaluable to Marshal Mallister. Together, They established Whisper Valley as a town where justice was swift but fair, where second chances were possible, but third chances had to be earned. As for Blackwood and his gang, rumors filtered in from time to time. A bank robbery in Nevada, a stage holdup in Colorado, but they gave Whisper Valley a wide berth. Perhaps Blackwood had found new legends to chase, or perhaps the memory of a town that refused to be intimidated had taught him a lesson of his own. 6 months after the standoff, on a crisp autumn evening, Nate closed the Silver Star early. The town had gathered at the church again, this time not for war planning but for a wedding, his wedding, to Emma. As he straightened his borrowed suit and prepared to meet his bride, a knock came at the back door of the saloon. Opening it, he found Marshal Mallister waiting, the familiar wooden box in his hands. "Thought you might want these back," Mallister said, lifting the lid to reveal the twin colts nestled in their velvet bed. "Not to wear, just to keep. They're part of your history after all." Nate studied the guns for a long moment. Once they had been extensions of himself, instruments of a deadly skill that had defined his existence. Now they seemed like artifacts from another life, important but no longer essential. "Keep them," he said finally, "or put them in the town museum Mayor Billings is always talking about. The prairie shadow deserves a proper burial." Mallister nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And Nate Hawkins, what does he deserve?" A slow smile spread across Nate's face, genuine and unguarded. "A future, one that doesn't cast shadows." The church bells began to ring, calling the town to witness a union that symbolized more than just the joining of two lives. It represented Whisper Valley itself, a place where past sins could be forgiven, where new beginnings were possible, where the quietest strength often proved the most enduring. As Nate made his way toward the church, he passed the spot where he had stood unarmed before Blackwood and his gang. The memory no longer carried the weight it once had. In its place was something lighter, more sustaining, the knowledge that he had finally understood what Bob and Sarah had tried to teach him all those years ago, that true courage isn't measured by the enemies you defeat, but by the friends you protect. That peace isn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is choose not to use the power he has. The gathered townspeople rose as Nate entered the church. Faces familiar and dear smiled their welcome. Doc Green with his perpetual bag of medicines, old Walt surprisingly sober for the occasion, young Tommy Jenkins fidgeting in his first proper suit, Wade standing tall and proud in his deputy's badge. And at the altar, Marshal Mallister waiting to officiate, the box of guns nowhere in sight. As the music swelled and Emma appeared in the doorway, radiant in white, Nate Hawkins felt the last whisper of the prairie shadow dissolve into the golden light streaming through the windows. The legend was truly gone now, replaced by something far more substantial, a man who had found his place, his purpose, his peace. In the years that followed, Whisper Valley would face its share of trials. Drought and flood, economic hardship and personal tragedy would test the bonds forged in that confrontation with Blackwood's gang. Yet through it all, the town remained united, drawing strength from the lesson taught by its quietest citizen, that true power lies not in the ability to intimidate, but in the courage to stand together. The Silver Star Saloon continued to be the heart of the community, its proprietor still methodically polishing glasses and listening more than he spoke. Children, who had once feared the quiet bartender, now brought their troubles to him, knowing they would find not judgment, but understanding. Men who had once whispered about his deadly past now sought his counsel, valuing his insight more than his legend. And if sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind carried echoes of distant gunfire, Nate Hawkins felt the ghost of the prairie shadow stir within him, well, that was a private matter between a man and his memories. The shadows were part of him still, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he had come and why the journey had been worth every painful step. For in the end, the story of the Prairie Shadow wasn't about a gunfighter's lightning draw or deadly aim. It was about a man who discovered that the hardest battle isn't faced with a gun, but with the heart. A man who learned that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to put down your weapon and offer your hand instead. A man who found, in the dusty streets of a forgotten frontier town, what all his years of wandering could never provide. Not just a place to exist, but a home to live for. Not merely people to protect, but a community to belong to. Not simply a legend to maintain, but a legacy worth building. The quiet man behind the bar, who taught a town, and perhaps a territory, that the deepest strength often speaks in the softest voice. That the most formidable power isn't the ability to take life, but the wisdom to transform it. And that sometimes the quietest rattler truly does strike the deepest, not with venom, but with truth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Ever could. Understanding, respect, perhaps even friendship. That was some gamble, Mallister said, joining them as the townspeople began to disperse, counting on Blackwood's pride to overrule his thirst for revenge. Wasn't a gamble, Nate replied. You can learn a lot about a man by the way he treats a bartender. Blackwood needed his legend. Without it, he's just another outlaw with a gun. Still, Emma said, finally releasing her grip on Nate, I thought for sure he was going to shoot you both. No, Wade interjected, approaching them with his shotgun, now resting comfortably against his shoulder. Blackwood's many things, but he's not stupid. A gunfight with odds that even isn't his style. He wants glory, not a bullet in the back. You think he's gone for good? Mallister asked, closing the box containing Nate's retired guns. Wade's expression darkened. No. Men like Blackwood, they don't let go easy. He'll be back, maybe not tomorrow or next week, but someday, when we least expect it. Let him come, Nate said quietly. Whisper Valley will be ready. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the dusty street, the town gradually returned to its usual rhythm. The excitement of the confrontation faded, replaced by the ordinary business of living. Shopkeepers reopened their doors, children resumed their games. The blacksmith returned to his forge. In the Silver Star Saloon, Nate stood behind the bar, methodically polishing glasses just as he had done every day for the past 5 years. Some habits, it seemed, were worth keeping. Quite a performance today, Doc Green observed, settling onto his usual stool. The whole town's talking about how Nate Hawkins faced down 20 gunmen without even wearing iron. Nate's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Wasn't my show. The town did the facing. That's not how they're telling it, the doctor replied, accepting the whiskey Nate slid toward him. By tomorrow the story will be that you stared Blackwood down so hard his bullets refused to leave their chambers. Let them talk, Emma said, emerging from the storeroom with a fresh bottle. Stories have power in places like this. Speaking of stories, Wade added, entering through the batwing doors, there's one more chapter needs writing. He approached the bar, his expression unreadable. Marshall offered me a job. Nate's eyebrows rose slightly. Deputy, Wade nodded, said Whisper Valley could use another man who knows how to read people. A hint of uncertainty crept into his voice. Thought I should ask you first, though, being as how I tried to kill you. Not so long ago. Water under the bridge, Nate replied, setting down the glass he'd been polishing. Though I'm curious, why stay? World's a big place for a man looking to start fresh. Wade considered this, turning his hat in his hands. Maybe because this is the only place I've ever been where a man gets judged by what he chooses to be, not by what he was. His eyes met Nate's. "You taught me that. You and the marshal both." "Bob's a good judge of character," Nate said simply. "If he trusts you with a badge, that's good enough for me." The tension eased from Wade's shoulders. "Appreciate that." "Though fair warning," Emma added with a mischievous glint in her eye, "deputy's pay won't cover your bar tab if you develop old Walt's habits." The laughter that followed felt like a seal on something new, not just a truce between former enemies, but the beginning of a friendship forged in the strangest of circumstances. As evening painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the silver star filled with townspeople, many still riding the wave of excitement from the day's events. The atmosphere was different from any night the saloon had known, less a refuge from the harshness of frontier life, and more a celebration of community, of standing together in the face of danger. Grace Alley took her place by the piano, her voice lifting in songs more joyful than her usual melancholy ballads. Old Walt bought a round for everyone with money no one knew he had. Even Mayor Billings made an appearance, his usual pomposity softened by the shared triumph of the day. Through it all, Nate moved with the same quiet efficiency that had defined him for 5 years, serving drinks, exchanging nods, listening more than he spoke. But those who knew him best could see the subtle change, a lightness in his movements, a clarity in his gaze, as if some final burden had been set down at last. "Penny for your thoughts," Emma said softly, finding a moment alone with him behind the bar. Nate glanced around the crowded saloon, taking in the faces of people who had risked everything that day, not for glory or reputation, but for their home, for each other. "Thinking about shadows," he replied, "how they can only exist where there's light." Emma followed his gaze, understanding dawning in her eyes. "And there's plenty of light in this room tonight. More than enough to chase any shadow away," he agreed. The celebration continued well into the night, the Silver Star Saloon glowing like a beacon at the heart of Whisper Valley. Stories were shared, friendships deepened, old grudges forgotten in the wake of collective courage. As the last patrons finally drifted homeward under a canopy of stars, Nate found himself on the saloon's porch, watching the quiet street with Emma beside him. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, clean and promising. "Something occurred to me today," Emma said, leaning against the porch rail. "All these years, I thought the Prairie Shadow was a gunfighter, a legend, someone to be feared. Wasn't he?" Nate asked. She shook her head. "No, he was a teacher, someone who learned the hardest lessons so others wouldn't have to." Her hand found his in the darkness. "That's the real legacy, isn't it? Not how fast you could draw, but what you chose to do when you put the gun away." Nate considered this, his eyes tracking the slow dance of moonlight and shadow across the sleeping town. "Bob told me once that the measure of a man isn't found in the lives he takes, but in the lives he touches. Didn't understand it then. And now?" His fingers tightened around hers. "Now I think maybe that's the only measure that matters." Morning found Whisper Valley transformed, not by the confrontation that had nearly torn it apart, but by the unity that had saved it. Men who had never spoken beyond casual greetings now worked side by side, repairing buildings and strengthening defenses. Women who had competed for status now shared recipes and childcare. The invisible barriers that exist in any community had not vanished, but they had thinned, made permeable by shared purpose. The marshal shook his head in wonder. "You've been planning this for a while, haven't you? Even before Reeves showed up with his warning." "Let's just say I never entirely forgot how to think like the Shadow," Nate acknowledged. "Just in case." Emma squeezed his hand. "And now? Is he truly gone?" Nate looked down at his Colts, still holstered and unfired, except for the single shot that had saved them all from Thorne's dynamite. With deliberate care, he unbuckled the gun belt and laid it on the bar. "Yes," he said simply, "his work is done." By midday, Whisper Valley had begun to recover from the attack. The wounded, both townspeople and outlaws, were being tended in Doc Green's expanded clinic. The dead, mercifully few on the town side, thanks to Nate's strategy, were prepared for burial. Captured outlaws were secured in the jailhouse and various reinforced structures around town, awaiting transport to the territorial prison. In Doc Green's back room, Nate found Red Jack Blackwood propped up in bed, pale but conscious. The outlaws' eyes tracked him as he entered. "Shadow," Blackwood greeted him, his voice weak but clear. "Heard you got Thorn." "Town got him," Nate corrected, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I just helped." A raspy chuckle escaped Blackwood. "Always the modest one." He studied Nate for a long moment. "We're not so different, you and I. Both made our legends, both tried to escape them." "Difference is," Nate replied quietly, "I found something worth escaping for." Blackwood's gaze drifted to the window, where Emma could be seen helping organize relief efforts in the street below. The woman. Her. This town, a life without looking over my shoulder. Nate leaned forward. "You could have that too, Jack. Doc says you'll live. When you're well enough to travel, you'll face charges, but with my testimony against what's left of Thorne's gang, maybe the judge goes easy on me?" Blackwood finished with a sardonic smile. "That your plan, Shadow? Redemption for a man who came to kill you?" "Think of it as a chance," Nate replied. "Same one I offered young Reeves 2 years ago. Same one Bob Mallister offered me in Deadwood." He rose to leave. "Up to you whether you take it." As he reached the door, Blackwood called after him, "Hey, Shadow." When Nate turned, the outlaw fixed him with an intensity that belied his weakened state. "If I do take this chance of yours, does it work? Does the past ever really let go?" Nate considered the question carefully. "No," he answered honestly. "It doesn't let go, but it does get lighter, easier to carry." Blackwood nodded, something like hope flickering briefly in his eyes. "Might be worth finding out." Outside, Whisper Valley hummed with activity. Repairs had already begun on buildings damaged in the fighting. Children released from the safety of the church ran through the streets, their games now incorporating exaggerated versions of the morning's events. The Prairie Shadow had become, overnight, a figure not of dread, but of protection in their young imaginations. Nate found Emma supervising the cleanup of the Silver Star. Together, they set about restoring order to their tavern, working side by side as they had for years. Overturned tables were righted, broken glass swept away, bullet holes marked for repair. "Think they'll come back?" Emma asked as they paused for a moment's rest. "Thorne's men who escaped?" Nate shook his head. "No. Without a leader, they'll scatter, find other gangs, other towns. Whisper Valley's proven too hard a target." Wade appeared in the doorway, his deputy's badge catching the afternoon sunlight. "Marshall sent me to tell you the telegraph's working again. He's contacted the territorial governor. There'll be a detachment of soldiers here tomorrow to take the prisoners off our hands." "Good," Nate nodded. "How's Lucas doing?" "Reeves? Doc says he'll keep the arm. Says he wants to talk to you when you've got a minute." Wade hesitated. "And there's something else. The town council's called an emergency meeting tonight at the church. They've asked specifically for you to be there." Emma and Nate exchanged glances. "What's it about?" she asked. Wade shrugged. Mayor Billings was tight-lipped. "Just said it concerns the future of Whisper Valley and the Prairie Shadow." After Wade left, a troubled silence fell between them. Nate moved to the window, looking out at the town that had become his home, that he had risked everything to protect. "They want me to leave," he said quietly. "Now that they've seen the Shadow again, they're afraid." "You don't know that," Emma protested, coming to stand beside him. "It's what always happens, Emma. The legend saves the day, then makes people uncomfortable. In peacetime." His mouth quirked in a sad smile. "Can't say I blame them." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me, Nate Hawkins. This town knows exactly who you are, what you are. They've known for years. You think they didn't. See how you placed yourself in the most dangerous positions today. How you made sure every shot disabled rather than killed. How you faced down Clay Thorne with empty hands when you could have cut him down where he stood. Her voice grew fiercer with each word. If they want to talk about the future of Whisper Valley, it's because they've seen the real prairie shadow at last. Not a killer, but a protector. Not a legend, but a man willing to become whatever his home needs him to be. The council meeting that evening packed the church to overflowing. Every citizen of Whisper Valley who could walk, crawl, or be carried had come to attend, creating a sea of faces that reflected the town's diversity. Ranchers and shopkeepers, newcomers and old-timers, the wealthy and the struggling, all united. By the day's events, Mayor Billings called for order, his usual pomposity tempered by genuine emotion. Friends, neighbors, fellow citizens of Whisper Valley, we gather tonight in the aftermath of what could have been our destruction, but has instead become our finest hour. He gestured to the assembled council members, Doc Green, Marshal Mallister, Samuel Porter, and several others representing the town's various interests. The council has convened this emergency session to address matters of grave importance concerning our future security and leadership. Nate felt Emma's hand tighten around his. Here it comes, he thought. Mr. Hawkins, Billings continued, fixing Nate with an unusually direct gaze. Would you please step forward? A hush fell over the assembly as Nate moved to stand before the council. He kept his back straight, his expression neutral, prepared to accept whatever judgment they rendered with the dignity he had cultivated over years of quiet service. Nathaniel Hawkins, Billings intoned formally, known once as the Prairie Shadow, proprietor of the Silver Star Tavern, resident of Whisper Valley these past 7 years. Nate inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. They descended quickly to join the small group gathered at the edge of town. Marshal Mallister, Doc Green, and several armed townspeople had positioned themselves behind a makeshift barricade, all eyes focused on the approaching horseman. As the rider drew closer, the moonlight revealed a familiar figure that brought gasps of disbelief from those watching. "Is that—" Mallister began. "Blackwood," Nate finished, his voice neutral, but this was not the proud, dangerous Red Jack Blackwood who had threatened Whisper Valley 2 years earlier. This man was haggard, slumped in the saddle, his once fiery hair dulled with dust and matted with blood. His crimson bandana hung loose around his neck, dark with what could only be dried blood. "Hold fire," Nate ordered, stepping past the barricade into the open street. The horse stopped a dozen paces away. Blackwood raised his head with visible effort, his eyes finding Nate's in the darkness. "Shadow," he croaked, the word barely audible. "Thought you were dead," Nate replied evenly. A ragged laugh escaped Blackwood's throat. "Not for lack of trying. Thorne's aim isn't what he thinks it is." With painful slowness, he opened his coat to reveal a crudely bandaged wound in his side. "Bullet took a piece of my lung, left me to die in the dirt." "Why are you here?" Wade demanded, stepping up beside Nate, his hand never far from his holster. Blackwood's bloodshot eyes shifted to his former lieutenant. "Hawkins, heard you went straight, wearing a badge now." Another pained laugh. "World's full of surprises." "Answer the question," Mallister barked from behind the barricade. "Same reason as before," Blackwood replied, swaying dangerously in the saddle. "Came for the shadow. But this time to warn him." "About Thorne," Nate said. It wasn't a question. Blackwood nodded weakly. "He's coming. Tomorrow at dawn. 37 men. Dynamite. No quarter." His voice dropped lower, forcing them to lean in to hear. "He's not after your reputation, Shadow. He wants to erase it, along with everyone who ever knew you." "We already know," Wade informed him. "Reeves got here first." "Luke?" Genuine surprise flickered across Blackwood's face. The kid actually made it. Good for him. His expression hardened. But you don't know everything. Thorn split his men, coming from 3 directions at once, using the old mining tunnels under the east end of town to get men behind your lines. Nate and Wade exchanged sharp glances. This was new information, and it changed their defensive calculations entirely. "Why tell us this?" Nate asked, studying the wounded outlaw carefully. "Why warn the man you came to kill 2 years ago?" Blackwood's face contorted with a complex mixture of emotions, hatred, respect, and something that might have been regret. "Because Thorn killed me over you," he said finally. "Because he thought I went soft for not gunning down an unarmed man in front of women and children." His breathing was becoming more labored, and maybe he was right. With that admission, what little strength remained seemed to drain from Blackwood's body. He slumped forward, barely catching himself on the saddle horn. "Let me see him," Doc Green called, hurrying forward with his medical bag. After a brief examination, he looked grimly at Mallister. "He needs immediate attention or he won't last the night. Take him to your office," the marshal instructed. "Wade, go with them. Keep a guard on him just in case." As they helped Blackwood from his horse, the outlaw's hand shot out, grasping Nate's shirt with surprising strength. "Shadow," he rasped, his voice barely audible. When Thorn comes, kill him, not for me, for what's right." Then his eyes rolled back, and he went limp in their arms. While Doc worked to save Blackwood's life, Nate gathered the town's defenders to adjust their strategy based on the new information. The mining tunnels complicated everything. What had been a defensible position was now vulnerable to attack from below. "We need to collapse those tunnels," Samuel Porter suggested. "I worked those mines years back. Know just where to set charges to bring them down." "With what?" Mayor Billings demanded. "We don't have dynamite of our own." "Actually," Wade interjected, "we might not need it." He turned to Nate. "Remember what you told me about the shadow? About watching, reading, knowing. A glimmer of understanding appeared in Nate's eyes. "We don't stop them from using the tunnels," he said slowly. "We let them come through, right where we want them." As the night deepened toward dawn, Whisper Valley prepared for what might be its final stand. Children and those unable to fight were gathered in the church at the center of town, the building's stone walls offering the best protection against both bullets and dynamite. Around them, in concentric circles of defense, the townspeople took their positions, not as frightened citizens, but as defenders of their home. At the Silver Star, Nate stood before the bar, methodically checking the pair of Colts he hadn't worn in over 2 years. The familiar weight of them felt both strange and right, like greeting an old friend who had changed during a long absence. Emma watched from the doorway, her own rifle held ready. "So the shadow rides again," she said softly. Nate looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the room. They had shared so many moments moments of joy, of quiet understanding, of the simple peace they had built together. "One last time," he promised. "After this, win or lose, the shadow stays buried for good." Outside, the eastern sky had begun to lighten, the stars fading one by one as the great wheel of night turned toward day. Whisper Valley held its breath, waiting for the coming storm, and for the quiet man who had taught them the true meaning of strength to once again become the legend they needed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "We fight," Nate said simply, "but not like before, not with tricks or bluffs." He moved to the window, gazing out at the darkened street. "Thorn won't be fooled by a peaceful town. He'll expect a trap. We need to give him something he doesn't expect." "Which is?" Mallister prompted. Nate turned back to face them, his expression set in lines of grim determination. "A ghost. The plan took shape over the next hours, each detail debated and refined as the night deepened toward dawn. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, Whisper Valley had a strategy. Desperate, perhaps even foolhardy, but their best hope against the coming storm. As the council dispersed to begin preparations, Emma pulled Nate aside, leading him to the quiet sanctuary of their living quarters above the tavern. "You're going to do it, aren't you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Become him again. The shadow." Nate sighed, the weight of what lay ahead settling onto his shoulders. Not become him, use him, like bait in a trap. "It's still dangerous. If Thorne's bringing that many men—" "He is," Wade confirmed, appearing in the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt, but Reeves is awake again. Fever's broken. He's been filling in some details you should hear." They followed Wade back to Doc Green's office, where Lucas Reeves sat propped up in bed, pale but lucid. His face was drawn with pain, but his eyes were clear. "Shadow," he greeted Nate. "Or should I say Hawkins now?" "Either name works," Nate replied, pulling a chair beside the bed. "You're looking better. Doc says I might keep the arm after all." Reeves attempted a smile that became a grimace. "Seems you're destined to keep shooting me in the same places." "What happened with Blackwood?" Wade asked, cutting to the heart. Of the matter, Reeves' expression darkened. "After we left here 2 years back, Jack was different, quieter, kept to himself. Started drinking heavy." He shifted uncomfortably. "The gang was losing faith in him. Said he'd gone soft after facing down the shadow and not pulling the trigger." "And Thorne?" Nate prompted. "Clay was always ambitious. Started whispering to the boys that Jack wasn't fit to lead anymore. That we needed someone who wouldn't hesitate." Reeves swallowed hard. 3 weeks ago they argued about something. Don't know what. Clay shot him in the back while he was pouring a drink. Called it poetic justice for a man who let a bartender humiliate him. Emma's hand found Nate's, squeezing tightly. After that, Clay took over, said we were going back to Whisper Valley to finish what Jack started, but not just to kill you, to burn the whole town to the ground, make an example. Reeves looked away, shame evident in his posture. I couldn't stomach it, tried to talk him out of it. He put a bullet in me for my trouble and left me for dead. So you came to warn us, Wade concluded. Why? You rode with them. You stood against us before. Reeves met his gaze steadily. Because 2 years ago, the shadow could have killed me. Should have killed me. Instead, he offered me a chance to be better. I was too stupid to take it then. He glanced at Nate. Figured it wasn't too late to take it now. Nate nodded, a simple acknowledgement that carried the weight of absolution. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Reeves cautioned. Thorne's coming with enough men to overrun this place twice over, and he's not looking for a fair fight. He plans to hit at dawn from all sides at once. When? Wade pressed. Day after tomorrow, if they keep the pace I heard them planning. Reeves hesitated. There's something else. Something worse. What could be worse than 30 gunmen? Emma asked. Thorne's got dynamite, lots of it. Stole it from a mining operation near Silver Creek. He plans to blow the town to splinters if you give him any trouble. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Dynamite changed everything. No barricades would hold, no defensive position would be safe. This changes the plan, Wade muttered. No. Nate's voice was quiet but firm. It makes it more important than ever. He stood, decision written in every line of his body. We continue as discussed, but with one addition. From his pocket he withdrew a folded paper, a wanted poster, yellowed with age. The face illustrated on it was younger, harder, but unmistakably his own. Below the sketch, in bold letters, The Prairie Shadow, wanted dead or alive, 5,000 reward. Where did you get that? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marshall's office, Nate replied. Bob kept it all these years, said it was a reminder of how far I'd come. His fingers traced the faded image. Now it's going to help save this town. By midday, Whisper Valley had transformed. No longer the peaceful settlement it had become, it now took on the appearance of a fortress preparing for siege. Men and women worked side by side, boarding windows, building barricades, transforming everyday items into tools of defense. At the Silver Star, Wade oversaw the conversion of the tavern into a fallback position, reinforcing doors and creating firing positions from the upper windows. Emma coordinated supplies, ensuring food, water, and ammunition were distributed throughout the town's defensive points. And Nate? Nate had disappeared into the marshal's office with the wooden box containing his legendary guns. What transpired? Behind those closed doors, only he and Mallister knew, but when he emerged hours later, something had changed. It wasn't anything as obvious as the guns. Those remained out of sight. It was in his bearing, in the liquid grace of his movements, in the watchful stillness of his gaze. The prairie shadow had returned, not as a killer seeking notoriety, but as a protector willing to embrace his darkest skills for the sake of those he loved. That night, as families huddled together in the designated safe zones, as men and women checked weapons with grim determination, as children were hushed and comforted by parents trying to hide their own fear, Nate stood alone on the roof of the Silver Star, watching the distant horizon. Emma found him there, a solitary silhouette against the star-filled sky. "You should be resting," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "Can't," he replied simply. She slipped her hand into his. "Thorne might not come, you know. Reeves could have thrown him off track. He'll come." Nate's certainty was absolute. Men like Thorne always do. They stood in silence for a long moment, the cool night air carrying the scents of sage and pine. "I'm sorry," Nate said finally. Emma looked up at him, surprise evident in her expression. "For what?" "For bringing this to our door." "To your door." His eyes remained fixed on the horizon. The shadow never truly left, just waited for a reason to return. "No." Emma's voice was firm as she turned him to face her. "This isn't your fault. The man who tends bar, who listens more than he speaks, who built a life here despite his past, that's who you are. The shadow is just a tool, a skill you can use when needed. And if the tool changes the hand that holds it?" Nate's question hung in the air between them. Emma stood on tiptoe to press her lips gently against his. "Then I'll be here to remind you of who you really are." Their moment was interrupted by footsteps on the ladder. Wade's head appeared at the roof's edge. "Ryder." "Coming," he announced tersely. "Just one, moving slow." "And thinking about what comes next?" "And what does come next?" Emma asked. "Now that you've managed to keep your badge and defeat Thorne without firing a shot?" Before Nate could answer, Wade appeared, his expression uncharacteristically solemn despite the celebration around them. "Chief wants to see you both. Something's happened." They followed Wade through the jubilant crowd to the Silver Star's back office, where Chief Mallister waited with Reeves and, surprisingly, the telegraph operator, Charlie Wilson. "What's wrong?" Nate asked, immediately recognizing the tension. In the room, Mallister handed him a telegram slip. "This just came in." The message was brief but chilling. "Thorne escaped prison wagon near Carson Pass. Stop 3 guards dead. Stop believed heading south with accomplices. Stop armed and desperate." "Stop!" "How?" Emma demanded. "He was shackled, surrounded by armed men." "Ambush," Charlie explained. "According to the follow-up wire, someone was waiting for them in the high pass. Professional job." "Not random, then," Nate observed quietly. "Someone planned this. Someone with resources and information about the transfer route." Reeves, who had been uncharacteristically silent, spoke up. "When I rode with Thorne, he sometimes mentioned connections. Powerful men who found his particular skills useful." "What kind of connections?" Wade pressed. "Never said exactly, but once, when he was drunk, he talked about doing work for men in suits who paid in gold." Reeves hesitated. Said they were building something big across the territory and needed certain obstacles removed. Nate and Mallister exchanged knowing glances. The railroad, the chief said grimly. Those powerful interests the governor mentioned. Makes sense, Nate agreed. Thorne was a useful tool for them until he wasn't. And now he's free again, Emma said, coming back here. Not just for me this time, Nate observed, for all of us. The celebration beyond the office door continued unabated, the town blissfully unaware that their victory had already been compromised. Nate felt the weight of the silver star on his chest, the responsibility it represented not just to uphold the law, but to protect those who trusted him. "What do we do?" Wade asked. "Town's exhausted. We can't ask them to mount another defense. So soon." "We don't," Nate decided. "This isn't their fight anymore." He turned to Mallister. "How many men can you spare that won't leave the town vulnerable?" The chief calculated quickly. 4, maybe 5 at most, assuming Thorne doesn't bring an army. "He won't," Nate said with certainty. "This time it's personal, not theatrical. He'll come with just enough men to get the job done." "Then what's your plan?" Emma asked, already knowing from his expression that she wouldn't like the answer. "We meet him before he reaches Whisper Valley," Nate replied. "Cut him off. End this away from innocent people." "You mean track him through rough country, outnumbered, against a man with nothing left to lose?" Emma's voice carried equal parts fear and frustration. "That's not a plan, Nate. That's suicide." "Not if we choose the ground," Nate countered. "Not if we use what we know about him against him." A tense silence followed as the implications settled over the group. This would not be a defensive action like before. This would be deliberate pursuit into dangerous territory against an enemy, both cunning and desperate. "I'll go with you," Wade volunteered immediately. "Me too," Reeves added. "I know how Thorne thinks better than anyone here." Mallister nodded grimly. "I'll select 3 more men, best shots we have." "No." Nate's quiet. "Refusal cut through their planning. Wade comes, Reeves too, if he chooses, no one else." 8 against 3, Emma protested. "Those odds aren't about numbers," Nate finished for her. "They're about skill, knowledge, and purpose. Too many men make too much noise, leave too clear a trail." Mallister clearly disliked the plan, but respected Nate enough to listen. "When do you leave?" "Dawn," Nate decided. "With fresh horses and 3 days' provisions." "And me," Emma stated firmly, her tone brooking no argument. "I'm coming too." Nate started to protest, but the look in her eyes silenced him. This was not the voice of a worried wife. This was the determination of a woman who had stood beside him through every challenge, who had defended their home with rifle in hand, who had earned the right to see this through. 3 against 8, then, he acknowledged softly. "But we control when, where, and how the confrontation happens." As the others left to make preparations, Emma remained, studying her husband with the penetrating gaze that had always seen through his carefully constructed facades. "You knew this would happen," she said, not a question but a realization. "You knew Thorne wouldn't be so easily defeated." Nate moved to the window, watching the celebration still unfolding in the main room of the tavern. "Not specifically, but men like Thorne, they don't just disappear when the story seems to end. There's always another chapter. And the Shadow, does he get another chapter too?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond its simple words. Nate considered, it carefully acknowledging its importance. "No," he said finally. "The Shadow's story is finished, has been for years." He turned to face her. "This isn't about him anymore. It's about us, about the future we're building. A future that apparently includes tracking down escaped killers." "In the wilderness," Emma observed dryly, though the tension in her shoulders had eased somewhat. "Just this once," Nate promised, crossing to take her hands in his. "To end what began long ago. After that?" Judge Thornton's offer? She guessed, surprising him. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You heard. Walls have ears, especially in a tavern. She squeezed his hands. Training a new kind of lawman. It suits you, Nate. Using everything you've learned, as the shadow, and as yourself, to shape something better. Before dawn, as Whisper Valley slept off its celebration, 3 riders departed silently from the livery stable. They carried little beyond necessities: food, water, ammunition, and the essential tools of survival in rough country. No badges gleamed on their chests. No symbols of authority marked their purpose. They rode not as representatives of law, but as individuals determined to protect what they valued. Their destination was Carson Pass, a treacherous route through the mountains 20 miles north. If Thorne was indeed heading south, he would need to come through one of only 3 navigable passages in the range. Carson was the most direct, and the one that offered the greatest advantage to those who knew how to use its terrain. The journey took them through landscapes of stark beauty and hidden danger. Ancient pine forests gave way to rocky slopes. Meadows, bright with late wildflowers, surrendered to narrow defiles where a man could be ambushed with little warning. Through it all, Nate led with the quiet confidence of one reading the land like a familiar book. "How do you know he'll come this way?" Wade asked as they made camp the first evening, hidden in a sheltered hollow high above the main trail. "Because it's what I would do," Nate replied, checking sightlines with practiced eye. "South Pass adds 2 days to the journey. North Pass requires specialized knowledge of the terrain. Carson is the obvious choice for someone in a hurry with limited local experience. Unless he has a guide," Reeves pointed out, "someone who knows these mountains." Today, for the second time in 2 years, you placed yourself between this town and those who would destroy it, Billings continued. Today, for the second time, you embraced a past you had long abandoned for the sake of people who once feared your very name. The mayor's voice softened. The council has deliberated on how best to acknowledge this service, on how best to secure Whisper Valley's future against threats both known and unknown, and we have reached a unanimous decision. From his pocket, Billings withdrew a small object that gleamed in the lamplight. A silver star, not unlike the one that adorned Marshal Mallister's chest. "Whisper Valley has grown beyond a single lawman's ability to protect," Billings declared. "The council hereby establishes a town police force, with Robert Mallister as its chief." He extended the badge toward Nate. "And with you, if you'll accept, as its first captain." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not of protest, but of approval. Nate stood frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. "I don't understand," he finally managed. "After what happened today, after the shadow returned." "Because of what happened today," Marshal Mallister corrected, stepping forward. "Because we saw that the shadow was never about killing. It was about protection, about standing between innocents and those who would harm them." Doc Green joined them. "You once told me the Prairie Shadow died the night you faced down Wade Hawkins and his gang, but that wasn't true, was it? He didn't die, he evolved, became something better." "The town doesn't want the gunfighter of legend," Samuel Porter added, his deep voice carrying throughout the church. "We want the man who taught us that true strength lies in restraint, in knowing when not to pull the trigger. The man who showed us," Emma said softly from beside him, "that sometimes the quietest voice carries the furthest." Nate looked from face to face, at the council members watching expectantly, at the townspeople whose expressions ranged from hope to admiration, at young Reeves standing in the back with his arm in a sling, even at Wade Hawkins, who had somehow become both deputy and friend. "I'm not sure I'm the right man for this," he said finally. "My past is exactly why you are the right man," Billings interrupted with unexpected firmness. "Because you know the darkness that men like Thorne carry. Because you chose to walk away from it, Because you understand that law without compassion is just another form of tyranny." He held out the badge again. "So, what do you say, Captain Hawkins? Will you help us build something that lasts?" In that moment, Nate felt the weight of the Prairie Shadow's legacy shift within him. Not a burden to be carried or escaped, but a foundation upon which something new could be built, something enduring. With steady hands, he accepted the silver star. The church erupted in applause, the sound washing over him like cleansing rain. Emma's arms encircled him, her eyes bright with unshed tears and fierce pride. Marshal Mallister, now Chief Mallister, clasped his shoulder in silent understanding. And somewhere in the back of the church, if one looked carefully, the ghost of a young deputy named Bob seemed to nod in approval before fading back into memory. In the weeks that followed, Whisper Valley transformed once more. The town police force took shape under Mallister's guidance, with Nate training a cadre of deputies in the art of prevention rather than punishment. Wade Hawkins remained his right hand, the two former adversaries forming a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Blackwood, true to his word, provided testimony that helped convict the surviving members of Thorne's gang. The judge, impressed by his cooperation and the circumstances of his warning, commuted his sentence from hanging to 10 years hard labor, with possibility of parole for good behavior. Young Lucas Reeves, once he recovered, asked to stay in Whisper Valley. To everyone's surprise, Nate hired him as a barkeep at the Silver Star, which Emma now managed full-time, while her husband attended to his new duties. "Why him?" Wade asked one evening as they watched Reeves efficiently serving customers. After everything, Nate's answer was simple. Because 7 years ago, Bob Mallister saw something worth saving in a burned-out gunfighter drowning his sorrows. In a Deadwood saloon. Seems only right to pass that chance along. The Prairie Shadow faded gradually from conversation, becoming once more a figure of frontier legend rather than daily reality. But in Whisper Valley, the story changed. Children, playing in the streets, no longer feared the Shadow's name, but invoked it for protection. Travelers passing through heard a different tale, not of a deadly gunslinger, but of a quiet man who had found strength in peace and courage in restraint. And in the evenings, when Captain Nathaniel Hawkins returned home to the Silver Star, he would sometimes stand for a moment in the doorway, watching Emma move among the tables, listening to Reeves tell exaggerated stories of adventures he'd never had, observing the townspeople who had become his family. In those moments, if shadows stretched long across the tavern floor, they brought not dread but comfort, reminders that darkness exists only where light shines, and that sometimes the quietest rattler truly does strike the deepest, not with guns or violence, but with the simple revolutionary act of choosing a better way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Nate Hawkins stood halfway down the stairs, his twin Colts hanging loosely at his sides. In the flickering lamplight, he seemed both more and less than human, a figure balanced between legend and reality, between vengeance and mercy. The famous Prairie Shadow, Thorne sneered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "Not so shadowy now, are you?" "Put down the dynamite, Clay," Nate said quietly. "It's over. Your men are captured or running. Blackwood's alive. This ends here." Thorne's face contorted at the mention of Blackwood. "Jack's alive. You're lying. He's in Doc Green's office right now," Wade confirmed from behind the bar, his shotgun unwavering. "Told us everything about how you shot him in the back." For a moment, confusion and rage warred in Thorne's expression. Then his face settled into a mask of cold hatred. "Doesn't matter. I didn't come here for Jack. I came for the legend. His grip tightened on the dynamite, its fuse burning steadily shorter. I came to be the man who killed the prairie shadow. That man doesn't exist anymore, Nate replied, taking another step down. You're fighting a ghost. Then I'll burn this. Whole place down with you in it, Thorne snarled, raising the sputtering dynamite. What happened next seemed to unfold in fractions of seconds. Emma dove behind a barricade, Wade ducked below the bar, and Nate moved with the liquid grace of his legend, his right hand flashing upward. The Colt barked once, its bullet striking not Thorne, but the dynamite itself, knocking it from his grasp. The still burning stick skittered across the floor, its fuse now perilously short. In the same continuous motion, Nate leaped from the stairs, rolling across the floor to snatch up the dynamite. With a powerful throw, he sent it sailing through an open window into the empty street beyond, where it detonated with a deafening roar that shook the tavern's foundations. Thorne, recovering from his shock, swung his revolver toward Nate, but the shadow was no longer there. Like his namesake, he had shifted position the instant the dynamite left his hand, becoming a blur that resolved behind Thorne, even as the outlaw's gun tracked empty space. Looking for me? Nate's voice came from just behind Thorne's ear. The outlaw whirled, firing blindly. The bullet splintered wood where Nate had been a heartbeat before. Now he stood 3 paces away, his Colt still holstered, his hands open at his sides. "Draw, damn you!" Thorne screamed, frustration bleeding into his voice. "Fight me like the killer you are." "That's your mistake, Clay," Nate replied, his voice calm despite the danger. "You think the shadow was about the guns, about killing." He took a step closer, seemingly oblivious to the revolver pointed at his chest. "It was never about that. It was about reading men, about knowing what they'll do before they do it." As if to demonstrate, he shifted slightly right, just as Thorne fired again, the bullet passing through empty air. The outlaw's eyes widened in disbelief. "Like how I know you've got 2 shots left," Nate continued, taking another step. "Like how I can see in your eyes that you're starting to doubt, to fear." Thorne fired again, wild and desperate. Again, Nate wasn't where the bullet traveled. "1 shot," the shadow observed quietly. "Make it count." Terror replaced hatred in Thorne's eyes. This wasn't a gunfight. It was something else entirely, something he hadn't prepared for. He had come expecting to kill a legend or die in the attempt. Instead, he found himself facing a man who made him feel small, predictable, already defeated. "What are you?" Thorne whispered, his gun hand trembling. "Just a bartender," Nate replied, "who learned to read men instead of kill them." With a cry that was half rage, half despair, Thorne fired his final shot. Nate moved, not entirely clear this time, the bullet grazing his arm, drawing a line of crimson across his sleeve. But then he was inside Thorne's guard, one hand gripping the outlaw's gun wrist with crushing force, the other pressed against his throat. "I could kill you right now," Nate said softly, his face inches from Thorne's. "Break your neck. Take your gun and put a bullet in your heart." The old shadow would have done that without hesitation. Thorne's eyes bulged, his breath coming in desperate gasps. "Then do it," he managed. "Prove you're still him." "That's just it," Nate replied, easing his grip just enough to allow Thorne to breathe. "I don't need to prove anything. Not to you, not to anyone." He moved his hand from the outlaw's throat to his collar, forcing him to his knees. "The prairie shadow died years ago. What you're facing now is something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to prove and everything to protect." As if on cue, Wade stepped forward, handcuffs ready. Emma emerged from behind her barricade, rifle trained on Thorne. Outside, the sounds of gunfire had diminished to sporadic pops as the town's defenders rounded up the last of the outlaw gang. Thorne, seemingly deflated by his defeat, allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance. But as Wade began to lead him away, he turned back to Nate, a last spark of defiance in his eyes. "You think this changes anything, Shadow? You think playing lawman wipes your slate clean? You've killed more men than I ever will. You can wear that bartender's apron and serve drinks and pretend to be civilized, but we both know what you really are." For a moment, something dangerous flickered in Nate's eyes, a glimpse of the shadow that still lurked within him. Then Emma was beside him, her hand finding his, and the moment passed. "You're right about one thing," Nate acknowledged. "I can't change what I was, but every day I choose what I am now." He glanced around the tavern, at the home he and Emma had built, at the town they had defended, at the life they had created together. And that choice has made all the difference. As Wade led Thorne away, Marshal Mallister entered, his weathered face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with triumph. "It's over," he announced. 17 captured, 6 wounded, 3 dead, the rest scattered into the hills." He clasped Nate's shoulder. "We did it." "The town did it," Nate corrected gently. "I just played my part." "Some part," Mallister chuckled. "Half of Thorne's men are convinced they were being shot at by ghosts. Said bullets were coming from everywhere at once, that the shadow seemed to be in 3 places at the same time." Emma raised an eyebrow at Nate. "Something you want to tell me about?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Just a trick I learned years ago. People expect a gunfighter to stand his ground, to face his enemy head-on. They don't expect him to move, to shoot on the run, to never stay in one place." "And the tunnels?" Wade asked, returning from delivering Thorne to the makeshift jail. "How did you get from there to the roof of the feed store in time to start picking off Thorne's men?" "I didn't," Nate replied. "That was Samuel Porter. I gave him my old hat and coat. Positioned him on the east rooftops while I took the west." "And Porter can shoot like that?" Mallister asked incredulously. Nate shrugged. "Doesn't have to. Men who believe they're facing the prairie shadow see what they expect to see. Half the battle is in their minds before the first shot's fired."